me also, since this is going to be videotaped and put on a website before we all have dinner tonight. Let me formally call the meeting to order. And then Ginger Leach, who is the Senior Director of Regional Support from the State Department of Education, from CORE, and also an answer to one of my prayers, is going to read us just the ground rules for our work. So Ginger, if you want to share your screen and take us through that, just as a reminder to everybody, the ground rules of our work.
I'll be happy to. All right. So again, we'll start each of our meetings with this statement. Give me just 1 second. We've got somebody waiting in the lobby. Let me let them jump in here with us. All right. So again, we'll start each of our meetings with this statement. And so I'll go ahead and jump right into that. The Tennessee Department of Education is excited to work with you on this opportunity to discuss the state's formula for funding public education. Before we begin, the department would like to remind you of the following. Conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved by the Tennessee General Assembly. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula. Consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in a new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents, records may be subject to public inspection pursuant to the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula.
Thank you, Ginger. Why don't we go, unless there are any questions on that, why don't we go to the next slide? And this is going to be our agenda. Let me, to set everybody's mind at ease, I want to just tell you a little bit about how I think we're going to spend this afternoon's time. We'll start with a roll call, and then we're going to review follow-ups from our first meeting. I want to acknowledge a couple of things. One, when we met last time, we had talked about getting an expert to come in and talk with us. I've since discovered that the Department of Education has a list of people who will work with the subcommittees. And there's a process where we can select from those folks. And we were not able to get that done in the short period of time between that, and I'm not sure they've even finalized the list. So I think the question will be, do we want to have someone come in at our next meeting or the meeting after that? But we are not going to have an expert come and talk with us today and answer our questions. Also, and Ginger, has any data been made available, or is that we're still waiting on the data?
We are still waiting on that. So I do apologize that that hasn't been shared out with the group yet. And as soon as I see that loaded in our Google Drive, or if it's sent directly over in some way, I'll flag that for you guys so that you know it is there and ready for you to dig into. Thanks,
Ginger. So I think two of the things we thought we might be doing this week, we aren't going to be doing, and so I just want people to know that up front. We're going to spend the bulk of our time generating a first draft list of resources that things we want to see incorporated into the funding formula. And we're going to generate a first draft of that and try and put each of those in one of four buckets, if you will, something that we must have, something that we should have, something that would be nice to have, and something that would be a long shot. I just want to emphasize, so we're going to spend this time generating this list, but it's a first draft. And then all of us will have really 6 weeks, but certainly 4 weeks to take that list and think some more about it. Opportunities to talk with people you think could look at it and maybe suggest some things we've forgotten or some difference of opinion on what's in a must-have. But it's just a sort of call it a straw man, a straw person document that we'll continue to refine and add to and edit over the next 6 weeks. And that list will be part of our final set of recommendations. So, I mean, today is just the first cut at that. But that's how we're going to spend much of our time. So we'll do that, and then at the very end of our time, we'll review the list. Ginger has graciously agreed to sort of keep that up to date, and we'll get that. We can take a look at it at the end of the hour, and then we can decide how we want to spend our time. Our next meeting is Wednesday, December 8th. So that's the plan. And if I could now, I'd like to just go through the roll call. If you when I say your name, if you would just say you're here for the record. Scott Bacon.
Here.
Senator Richard Briggs. Katie Core.
Here.
Stan Harville.
Here.
Representative David Hawk.
I am here.
Chris Lestos.
Here.
Jessica Steed. Lisa Trail.
Here.
Lynn Bolt.
Here.
And Amanda Waddell.
Here.
Terrific. Thank you. Scott, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I guess I'm going to put you on the spot. When we met last week, we all introduced ourselves, said a word or three about, what we do during the day. Some people mentioned something about their family. And then I asked everybody, just so we can get to know each other a little bit, to say something about an experience you've had that really is part of what you bring to the work, something that maybe formed a belief you have or affected your life. We're all on record. When you go onto the website, you can watch how each one of us answered the question last week. And I hope you'll take the time to do that. I talked a little bit at our first meeting how important I think it is for us to get to know each other a little bit, so that when it comes time to making recommendations, we're talking with each other and know each other and not talking over each other or not listening to each other. So I'd appreciate it if you just tell us a little bit about yourself, and if you can think of an experience you had that affects what you're bringing to this table, we'd all appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan. I'll be glad to. My name's Scott Bacon. I live in Knoxville. I'm on this particular panel through some work that I'm doing with some of you already with the Education Foundation Board that works with the commissioner. And I represent Clinton City and Anderson County on that. So that's why Ginger and I had a nice little conversation on the front end with her Anderson County Clinton roots. I have been in education since 1990 when I went to work for Knox County Schools in their public affairs office. Prior to that, had been a youth market director for the local Coca-Cola bottler in East Tennessee, the Roddy family. I know Stan knows all about them and the history of their work in the community. That kind of set me on a path of my career largely has been related to community relations, building partnerships between schools and community organizations, large and small. And after 25 years of doing that in Knox County, decided to go out on my own. And so I do a lot of those activities with local school districts and education foundations in the Knoxville area. But obviously have a slant toward a lot of things going on in Anderson County and Clinton. In terms of a single event necessarily, I don't know that I could point to one of those as much as this whole thing about education bit me early in my career when I started at Coca-Cola, because I was blessed to work for an organization that believed in community engagement, believed in investing in schools, and Pat Roddy, who was the owner of the company, shared with me that that was important to them for a lot of reasons. chiefly, mainly because it's the right thing to do for young people. And when you work for somebody who's their first thing is not it sells Coca-Cola, but it's the right thing to do for young people, that plants a seed that grew in me to find ways to do the right thing for young people. And so that's kind of what led me to down this path through 25 years with Knox County, and now on my own trying to find the Pat Roddies that are out there in the community now in the various places that I do work to do the right thing for young people. And so that's kind of why I'm interested in this process, because I think that's what we've got a chance to do in the state of Tennessee, to make sure that we're doing that for folks from Bristol to Memphis and from Chattanooga all the way up to LMU. How about that, Lisa? So that's pretty much me, and again, live in Knoxville and work in the surrounding areas.
Thanks so much for sharing that with us. And I live in a community also that has been affected to the positive by Coca-Cola. Obviously, the Benwood Foundation and Lyndhurst Foundations both are
very strong advocates of, yes.
Indeed.
Yes.
So yeah. Welcome and thank you. And I guess we'll go to the next slide. And then, if I could, well, we'll just jump ahead on those. Ginger, you want to do those too? And then I want to share sort of the norm, if you would be willing to take us through the norms and the guiding questions. But you want to do this one first? That's fine.
Absolutely. So just as a few reminders, as we get started, the first is we really want you guys to maximize your experience on this committee. And so that includes, looking at the PowerPoint and things ahead of time so you kind of have a lens for what our meetings are going to be focused on. We're going to try to get those out to you guys as quickly as possible each time. So I know you're not getting a ton of time to look at them ahead of time, but just skimming over them so you're kind of prepared for the conversation. And then also, we really want to encourage you to engage in conversations with stakeholders in your community to help cultivate some of that feedback that you can bring back to these discussions. And then in some cases, it may be feedback that you also want to submit to the tnedu.funding@tn.gov email address to make sure that we also have that feedback in writing as well. So if you get feedback submitted to you directly, or you capture feedback and conversations from people, just having that collected in one place and sharing that over will help both discussions here, as well as ensuring that we have a broader scope of feedback from stakeholders from across the state. When you're thinking about engaging with those stakeholders, there aren't limitations on who you should or should not talk to, for how long, and I'll actually show you guys in a few minutes some resources that are in your Google Drive in case you haven't had a chance to look at that yet. And those may prove handy as you engage in conversations with stakeholders, and it may also help you as you kind of build confidence in talking about this school funding piece. The next, if I can get, there we go. For each of you guys, you all carry very specific expertise that you're bringing to this conversation and that you'll be able to bring to the conversation with your stakeholders. That does not mean that you have to be a school funding expert. We intentionally brought these groups together to make sure that we are looking at all aspects and looking at all the different stakeholder groups who can help us really know what are those things that we need to be considering for this formula to really address student needs. And so you all know what those needs are. You know what districts in your areas need based on the services that you all are providing to them. And so we just want you to really leverage that expertise in these conversations, because that viewpoint is so valuable as we, engage in this throughout the next several months.
Thanks, Ginger. Could you, can you toggle over to the other?
I can.
Terrific. So just as a reminder to everybody, and Scott, you probably haven't seen these before. We talked a little bit about norms, just pretty obvious ones, but we're going to all try and be fully present and ignore whatever comes up on our other screens during the meetings. And as much as possible, and I know it's not always possible, but keep your camera on just so we can all have a sense of what you're thinking and doing. Want everybody to be respectful to all ideas and all people. We want everybody to strive for equitable participation. And we want to keep students at the center of our meetings. So those are the 4 norms. Anybody think of a 5th that they want to throw onto this and make it part of how we do our work? Okay, we'll keep those as our 4 and go on. Want to go to the guiding questions? And then it's going to get smaller and smaller, but all right, let's stop there. That's great. These are questions that as we start working on our recommendations, I think we want to keep top of mind. At some point, we may want to have conversations about each of them, but I think they're really important, and I want to review. A couple of them come directly from the department, and a couple of them come directly from the PowerPoint that we were sent in advance. One is, what do you hope to be true for students in Tennessee? What resources are needed to support the students we represent? And that's the one we're going to be working on today. Should districts get the same amount of money for each student they educate? Or should Tennessee provide districts with more funding for some students with greater needs? For example, students with disabilities, students living in poverty. This is really a guiding question around weighted formula, right? Do we want Tennessee to invest the same amount of money in education and distribute it differently? Or do we want Tennessee to invest more money in education? How important is transparency in a funding formula? How would we measure transparency if it is important to us? How important is sustainability? And how would we measure sustainability? How can we help all students recognize the value of an education and be prepared for a bright future? How do we maintain the focus on students' needs and keep the issue of funding from being politicized? And then, are there grade bands, early grades, upper grades, where more funding should be prioritized because of what is required during those years? This is a list of sort of guiding questions that we'll keep revisiting. And it's my understanding that we can also, in our recommendations, provide recommendations on each of these as well as the recommendations on what should be in the formula. That's open for conversation or addition, but we'll keep it there. We'll send it to you electronically so you can look at it and add to it as we go forward. But those are our guiding questions so far. And then finally, these are just some follow-up items. We talked about the expert. We can have the expert come to us for the next meeting on I think it's the 8th of December or the first meeting in January. And I would just encourage people, as you think about the questions, I know there were some issues raised the last time about what do the best formulas do? What do other states do? Those were some of the questions people started thinking about. But just, as you're working on this, start to jot down the questions. We will have some time with one of the experts that the department has secured. Katie, last time you asked a question about weights and outcomes, and I think you got an answer back. I'm wondering if you'd share it with the group.
Sure. Thanks, Dan. It's so good to see everyone. Happy whatever day this is. Wednesday? I don't even know what day this is. Tuesday? Wednesday. There we go.
Wednesday.
It's one of those weeks. So Dan asked me to sit in on the chair meeting last Friday because he was at a doctor's appointment. And so I did that and asked a specific question. I was a little confused when we had seen, I don't know if you all remember, but the first set of slides that we saw last week had a triangle, and actually Ginger might even be able to find this slide, had a triangle that showed kind of how the state is thinking about the different components that will go into a formula. It had the base at the bottom that was the biggest part of the triangle, and then it had weights. There we go. Thank you, Ginger.
Wow.
Whoever just
well done, Ginger.
that was very impressive. So the base is at the bottom, then you have weights for individual student subgroups, direct funding, which might be specific programs that the literacy initiative or something like that that the state wants to do, and then this part at the top, outcomes. And I was a little confused about the difference between outcomes and weights in the first way we talked about it. And so I asked that question of the commissioner last Friday, and she was very helpful in clarifying. And I told Dan about this, and that is why he suggested that I just share. And you all may already realize this. I just did not quite understand the difference. But basically, what I was familiar with in terms of student-based funding formulas is the base amount. Every student receives $10,000 or whatever it is, and then the individual weights depending on that student's needs. Is it an English learner student, a special education student, economically disadvantaged, et cetera. All of that is what is most common that I have seen in student funding formulas. And then, of course, the direct funding if there's occasion for a state initiative that they want to fund. But this outcomes piece was really interesting to me. And the commissioner made it very clear that they're very intent on using the student-based funding formula to drive different behavior in our schools. And so some of the examples that she gave me is that if we want as a state to say that it's really important to us to eliminate achievement gaps between Black students and white students, or between English learner students and non-English learner students, that you can actually put some money into that outcome section, that if a district is doing really, really well eliminating those achievement gaps, or making some specific gains in an area that's important to the state, that district will get more funding. So I just was really intrigued by that. I wanted to share that back with the team. If you all were aware of that already, I apologize, but it helped me to understand that this is an area that we can actually think about what we want to be different, in addition to the weights that we will be giving different student subgroups. So happy to answer any other questions if that made sense, or feel free to poke holes in it if it did not.
Lisa?
Katie, were they talking about these dollars being identified before or after a district is achieving or trying to achieve these, let's say, achievement gaps? So is this something that's putting the money in front of, or is it after you've already achieved it? You're kind of like, we have to wait until growth dollars come after you've already grown and spent the money. Did they say that?
They did. Somebody asked us a very similar question, and so I appreciate that, Lisa, because I agree. We all know how it works on a district level, where the funding is in arrears, really. And so they actually said for this piece, it would be after the district has shown gains that the funding would then go into the next year's budget. So it's still going to make that particular part challenging for districts, but I do think that there's some potential there for us to discuss, how to use those dollars in the most effective way. So,
okay, thank you.
Representative Hawk, you had a question?
Thank you. A broad question I'll ask in a moment, but as we're looking at the triangle here as well, talking to some school districts across the state, not only would the additional funding be good for some of our higher performing schools, but also if we could reduce the paperwork, for lack of a better word, if we could reduce some of the hoops that they have to jump through to do this. So if a school district is performing in a higher manner, maybe they don't have to do this, which could be not necessarily additional funding, but would save them dollars on the back end. So I would make that point as we're looking at this very interesting triangle that looks at the funding as well. Dan, I don't want to change gears if some folks have questions about that. I did put a question in the chat that we can talk about later when Katie's done with her conversation, if that is better for you, Dan.
Katie, I think you're good.
I accidentally put my hand up, but I actually do have a thought based on what the commissioner said for Representative Hawk's comment. So I apologize about that. I'm still working on Teams. This is a new platform for me. So Representative Hawk, I think that is such a great question and a great point. And I do remember that the commissioner said that a driving principle for this work is transparency and simplicity, because the BEP is so complicated and so onerous on anybody to figure out, frankly. And so I think that there's a place for us as a group to kind of really push on trying to make this easier and less red tape or paperwork on the back end, so that districts can understand and anticipate their funding from year to year in a way that's not really the way it is now with the BEP. So just wanted to say I applaud that question.
Katie, can you answer a question very quickly related to in Clinton Elementary, South Clinton Elementary, North Clinton Elementary make up Clinton City Schools? These three examples of outcomes don't fit their model because they're all based on high school students. Did they give other outcomes examples?
Yes, and I actually asked that exact question, not about high school, but about other examples. And so the example that the commissioner spoke to was if you have significant achievement gaps between Black students and white students, or between Hispanic students and white students, or special education students and non-special education students in your district, and you showed that those in any grade level, in elementary, middle, or whatever, and you show that those gaps are decreasing from year to year, you'll get additional dollars. So that was the big example that was discussed on Friday.
Thank you.
And I'm sure there are others too that we can
Sure.
brainstorm, but that was the one that came up.
Because I know we have some small districts across the state that do just handle the elementary function, up in Cott County, for example.
That reminded me of one other thing that was said at the meeting that I was very intrigued by. This doesn't affect Metro Nashville, but it will affect some of you all, which is that they are going to move to a district allocation as opposed to a county allocation for the fiscal capacity component. So that is a big help for those of us in areas that have more than one school district in a county. So.
Thanks, Katie. Representative, do you want to ask your question now?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And as we were looking at the questions a few moments ago before Katie began, it just struck me, are we looking at the BEP formula from an educational foundation perspective, from the space that some of the folks on the call have expertise in the foundations, the private public partnerships we're looking at, or are we looking at the broad BEP, the full formula? So I just want to make sure that I'm on the same page with everybody, that we're looking at it from a public-private educational partnership foundation, or we're able to open up every aspect of the BEP and say, we think this, and this.
So I'm going to weigh in here, and I'm going to hope that Ginger says that's right, but we'll see. So I understand that it is the full the entire funding formula, that we are supposed to use our unique vantage point as partners, funders. We see some things that other people may not see, but that doesn't mean that's the only thing that we can comment on or make recommendations on. But that's the unique vantage point that they've asked us to make sure we use the unique lens. The one friendly amendment I would make is they've cautioned us in the meetings I've been in not to look at this as a review of the BEP, because that's in litigation for a number of reasons. But the emphasis has been we're going to build something new, completely new, and that's what they want. Sort of start from ground zero and build up, not try and change what we have. So that's the one friendly amendment I'd make to your question. Ginger, was that right? He said, hopefully.
Yes, well done. Yeah, so I think it is you all bringing your perspective to this, but that's going to expand beyond, what you might initially be thinking for that. And definitely we're looking at a new formula versus revising the existing one. So I think you guys, you all have a very unique perspective in seeing all of the things that, districts need, students need, all of that, that might be different from the Chamber of Commerce group or the Suburban Urban group or, all the different subcommittees that we have. And so we're very interested in what you all can and have already identified as needs for students that we should be thinking about in this new formula. So well done, Dan.
Thanks. Let's go through those other two follow-up items, and then we'll get to the meat of the meeting.
Okay. So I wanted to just share with you guys really quickly the Google Drive that's linked. There's two linked in your invitations. I'll keep those linked throughout all of the invitations. One of them will take you directly to the meeting folder for our upcoming meeting, the one for that invitation. But the other one is going to take you to a broader Google Drive. You'll see the subcommittee folders for everyone else. But there's also a toolkit in here that may prove beneficial as you're having conversations with stakeholders, could be districts and other stakeholders. It may also help with building like just your confidence, your understanding, conversation, and thinking through that as you go into those. So there is one that's specific to committee members. There's also this FAQ. This is embedded within the committee member toolkit, but then it's also listed separately in case that's helpful. And then you're welcome to look through these others as well. But I just wanted to make sure that you knew those were there in case that was something that might be helpful for you. The other thing that I wanted to show you is from the overview PowerPoint you had last time. If you've not had a chance to really spend any time looking at these resources, those might be beneficial as well, to just, again, continuing to sort of drive your thinking as you're generating ideas and sharing those with stakeholders to kind of get their response of, are these things we should be including? And if so, are those the must-haves, the nice-to-haves, and so on? And then the last piece I have for you guys is just sharing that we are planning to have some professional development opportunities available that will share both general school funding as well as talk about the 3 different models. Since we are looking at building something new, we do want to make sure that we're thinking about that from all sides. And so that is should be available in December. That's the anticipated availability, and that will be available for you guys and some other identified stakeholders to kind of help build your understanding of this as we go through. So as Dan shared earlier, we're going to really focus today on generating ideas for those resources, those needs for students. That's going to be coming from what you all already know. You've already heard from stakeholders, and then we would just ask that in between sessions, you take those ideas out, talk to other people, see what else you would want to add to that, what kind of response you get, all of those things. And then over time, we'll continue to start building more understanding of just the school funding in general.
All right, thanks. And I would just add to Ginger's comment, if there's any material that people want or want to share, I received from Katie a town hall protocol that she's used, and we will share that with everybody. Stan, I think last time you mentioned the SCORE report on funding. We'll send that out to everybody. Just want to have a free-flowing information, and if you find something that you want to share it. If you want us to track something down, tell us what it is, and we'll do our best to track it down. But that's the last item on our follow-up item list. Okay, could we go to the next slide? Thanks, Ginger. So Ginger, you want to take us through the overview and then the next slide as well?
Sure. So as you guys are engaging in this discussion, so this will really be just kind of open for you guys. I think Dan has a specific kind of method he wants to use for this to make sure we all have an opportunity to share. But you're really thinking about what are those resources that you, resources, opportunities, needs that you already know that you want to see put on the table for discussion for including in the formula. And so we want to get ideas from all of you guys and then let you all discuss where should those go as far as those must-have, should-have, nice-to-have, and then long shots. So when we're thinking about the must-haves, you'll see on here, those are things that are going to fall into federal and state law, things that may be for safety reasons. But we can also think about other things. If there are things that you all see across the board, all districts and all students should have access to this. This is something that we really want to see included in that must-have. Somewhere in the formula, we want to see this exist. We want to see this maybe as part of the base or, you know, in some other component. Then we want you to put that out on the table and this group can discuss that. Should-haves are the things that may not be mandatory as far as law, but are things that we want to ensure that student or student groups receive in order to access a quality education. Once we have our must-haves and our should-haves, we're also thinking about what are those nice-to-haves? What are the other things? They're not mandatory, they're not essential, but they may provide some additional benefit to students. And we would, if possible, we'd like to see these things included. And so again, as y'all are bringing up ideas, we want to think about which bucket they might fall in and let you all kind of debate that and come to consensus on where should those fall. And then there's going to be some resources that just really don't fall in those first three. And there are things that may be longer down the road or things where just like, this would be really, really great. We're pretty sure this is, you know, may not be possible, but we want to put it out there. And so those are things that we could put on that long shot list. Any questions about that part before I move us to the next slide?
I would just make a quick comment. I think what Ginger said, and I think it's really important, that we are construing must-have pretty broadly. It is broader than the legal requirement. So just underline that.
And then the process, so Dan's going to, like I shared earlier, Dan's going to take us through a process to have you guys share out, kind of brainstorm those ideas for today. And then we also want to come back and have discussion about those to really decide where do we think those fall within these different buckets. And then, so we have them categorized. I'll be taking notes as we go throughout this, and at some point, if we're ready to actually make a formal recommendation that this item live in the must-have bucket, I'll make sure to record that. If we're still just in that brainstorming space today, where we're just generating ideas, but we're not able to categorize them yet, I'll capture all of that so that in our next meeting, we can start off with what else do we want to add and how do we want to categorize. If we do have formal recommendations, we'll also go back and revisit those to see if any of those things need to be revised.
So again, I don't have any magic process here. What I think I'd like everybody to do is to take a couple minutes and jot down 3 to 5 of your must-haves. 3 to 5 of your must-haves, and we'll just go round robin, create a list. If you don't have 3 to 5 must-haves and have a couple of must-haves and a couple of should-haves, that's fine too. But just take a minute, write down, just trying to be helpful. I asked Ginger when we were talking about it, and she said, well, she might put instructional coaches as a must-have. That's an example of something you might decide. So take, you know, everybody's own point of view, and just as a warning, Amanda, I'm going to do the same thing I did last time and go reverse alphabetical order. So we'll go back up the list. Sorry.
Dan?
Yes, Lynn.
I have a situation here I have to take care of. I'm going to be a few minutes on that. I'm sorry.
Well, come back when you can, but take care of the situation.
I am so sorry. You said be present, and I'm present, but I have a construction repair going on here. Blah, 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 you know.
Okay. Well,
all right.
Come back when you can. Thanks, Lynn.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, we ready to go? Amanda, would you lead us off? And Ginger, you're going to keep notes of all this, right?
I am, and if it's okay with everybody, I'll stop sharing my screen so you all can see each other a little better. Is that okay, or do y'all need the prompt up there? Okay.
So I may be way off base. This is why I hate going first.
Well, and if you want to just do one or two, that's fine.
Okay.
If you want to go with that, whatever you want to do is fine.
So I was thinking incredibly basic for must-haves, just safe structures and spaces, qualified instructors, and equal access to both of those things for every student.
Terrific. Lynn is not with us, so Lisa?
Amanda, I went basic too, so it's okay. When you say must. So I started with quality teachers. That to me is like the must. And that really comes back to, are we paying teachers what we need to keep those quality teachers? Counselors, either for both mental health type counseling as well as for school counseling. So somebody may want to change that word from counselor to, maybe school counselors, and then you have your mental health counselors. Nurses are vital in our schools now. And then those coaches, whether you call it an instructional coach or a classroom management coach, but those extra people that can help teachers teach. That was mine.
Thanks, Lisa. Chris, I think you're next up. You're still on mute, sorry.
Can you hear me now? All right. I went very, very basic as well, starting with consistent and predictable. I think making sure that our districts can rely on this, because this isn't an overnight sort of game. This is going to take several years to move the needle on these things. So definitely a allocation that is consistent and predictable. One that addresses specific needs and challenges. I'd like to see it drill down as much as possible. Again, back to that transparency and ability for communities to engage. And lastly, I know we're talking about it being driven by students, but I wanted to say it again, that every dollar needs to be attributed and focused on students first. So no matter what the process is, we have to be able to bring it back to an individual student, their experience, and their path forward.
Thanks, Chris. Representative Hawk?
Thank you. And my comments would mirror what we've heard so far for the most part. What Lisa mentioned, I'll put a little more finer point on it, on educational intervention specialist, someone who, what we call now RTI. I think that we've seen value in that, and we need to make sure that is a substantial part of the funding, that our students do get that, number one, highly qualified teacher, X number of hours a day, but some additional tools be given to that student as well. And I think that's a must-have in terms of funding. I'll reiterate as well, I think safe school buildings, although facilities are sometimes a boondoggle and get very expensive, and that expense falls to local governments in terms of funding. I think that a new formula going forward should have a stronger, more substantial investment in school buildings and technology as well. So I would like to see that. But I'll echo the other comments: healthcare professionals, mental health professionals. I think those are critically important as parts of a must-have as well. So thank you.
Just for point of clarification, would you separate the technology from the building, or are they are they part together?
In this day and time, they're really together. I would put them as a component together, although some virtual learning that's going on is technology could be seen as beyond the brick and mortar that we've got in our school buildings. But at this moment, I can see them connected.
Thanks. Stan?
Can I ask a point of clarification just so I can
Sure.
make sure my notes are clear? Representative Hawk, when you mentioned health professionals, are you thinking just the like the mental health counselors that were mentioned earlier, or are you thinking about that and other things?
I'll reiterate what Lisa was saying, the nurses within as close a ratio we can have nurses inside a school building itself, I think is important. In addition, I think a mental health counselor inside each school building is important as well. Those are two positions. And as we talk about ratios of funding those within a school district, we can get into the semantics after that. But ideally, in a perfect world, and that may go down to the nice to haves, but personally, I would like to see a nurse in each school building, a mental health professional in each school building as well. And it doesn't have to be a doctoral degree mental health professional. It can be a counselor. I'm just to qualify that. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Stan?
Well, all the good ones seem to have been taken. I also say instructional coaches are very important. I see the difference they've made here in Hamilton County. I would also look at support staff very closely. Great buildings are good, but if you don't have good custodians and people that take care of them and keep them up, maintenance people, so on, that becomes an issue. I look at that as an infrastructure a thing. Assistant principals. You're not afforded very much for assistant principals at this time. I think we get afforded 4 of them for 10,000 students, and that just doesn't go very far. So I would think that would be a position that would have to be talked about quite a bit. Department chairs in high school get a lot dumped on them that are very important curriculum things, books, different things like that. So I look, again, being a former principal, I look at that support staff that has to be there behind the teachers to support everything else.
Thanks. Katie?
It's so great to hear because I think we have so much in common across the board here. So I also had nurses, way more than we have now. I also had assistant principals. We have some really small schools that, don't really they can't really afford an assistant principal. I think every school needs an assistant principal. In Nashville, and Stan will certainly appreciate this, I also want an increase in EL teachers. And so those districts who have a large percentage of EL students, we are really struggling there. And then I wonder, the counselor job description is crazy. It is so full of details. A counselor is everything from obviously the mental health needs of a student, the academic pathway of a student, college counseling, state testing administrator. I wonder if there's an opportunity for us to make some recommendations, not just that we want counselors increased, but also I would like to see a college counselor in every single high school, in addition to that mental health counseling role that is so critical, which also brings me to my last piece, which was the increase of social workers to accompany that mental health component for our kids. But mostly in alignment with almost everybody on the call. So that was really, really neat to hear.
Thanks, Katie. Scott?
Katie, I'm glad you mentioned social workers. I've seen particularly in Anderson County, but also up in Cott County, thanks to some federal dollars that came into those two districts through the AWARE grant that was an outgrowth of the Sandy Hook shootings. But just the difference those individuals have made in terms of reducing barriers to families and to children has been phenomenal. That's made a huge difference in terms of not only school attendance, but also academic gains for those young people as well. So kudos for bringing that one up. I've got another crazy one that I put under must have. And again, I don't know about the other parts of the state, but those of us who are in East Tennessee and the mountainous terrains that we deal with, internet access is a huge issue, particularly during COVID when we were, everybody was having to look at the virtual scenarios. But it's a lot bigger issue than just that COVID related issue. Because I think about young people who don't have access. My children going through did. When it came time to work on a homework project or some other project, they had access and they dealt with it. These poor children that live in these scenarios where they literally can't get internet, that's an issue. And I know that's a bigger issue than state education funding, but unless we start to make it a priority in terms of what it's doing to young people, we're just going to keep kicking this can down the road. And we've got to fix this for our state. And obviously it's going to have an impact for young folks. And then I'll leave it at that because I got another one that's more of a should have, I guess. I will mention one thing that came up during and I know Stan was there and I think Chris were both there at the town hall in Knoxville. A lot of folks at that meeting stood up and talked about special ed issues. And I know that's a lot of federal dollars. But again, if we're going to be trying to meet needs of students that where they are and who they are, there may be some things within special ed that we need to target on as well to make sure that we've got equal access for young people with special needs.
So I'm not sure what I'm allowed to do. Can I suggest, so I'd like to just suggest a couple more in addition. This has been a great conversation. A couple that I wondered about, maybe this is a friendly amendment to Katie and others' comments about college advisors. I wish we could think about something that would take care of they could work in the summer. So maybe 12-month college advisors. We see so much melt of the students who say they're going to college and then never get there. So I'd like to at least think about 11 or 12 months to those positions. My wife, many years, kindergarten, first grade teacher, and the literacy materials, I think, are really, really important, and numeracy materials, the hands-on, the things that teachers use, and we've underfunded that and the professional learning of teachers for too long. So sort of a bigger bucket of the materials as well as the professional learning are things that I think are really central to having students start well and continue well. The other one that I wonder what other people are thinking about, there's been a lot of focus on early post-secondary opportunities, the EPSOs, and thinking about how much funding should go into that, whether that's an AP course or a certification or some kind of opportunity for students to earn a credential. I think that's a good investment in many cases, not in all, but in many. So those are some that I would suggest to the list if I could. We've heard a terrific list. I'm wondering, do we want to take a few minutes to add things that we didn't make our must-have list, but we want to put out there as be nice to have?
Dan, I have a question.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm new to Tennessee, so maybe this will help me define. So I guess as we talk about this, has the state or as this group, should we define what the base means for us? So from my mind, when I think of base, that's, what funding is needed for a student without need or disadvantage to achieve college or career. Is that where we're all starting from? Or is that even relevant in this conversation? Because, I'm just trying to follow along. We went from, my goal would be that this is individual. This is down to the individual student, their experience, and exactly what they need. But again, not being from Tennessee, it sounded like the rest of the comments were focused on my understanding of BEP. It's this, very transactional. So I wonder if that helps, or maybe that'll help me, or does that even make sense to anyone else on the call? I'll stop talking and see if that does.
I can address that a little bit, Dan, based on some
Please.
comments from the Friday meeting, if it's helpful. So absolutely, Chris, the last thing I think that state wants is a laundry list of resources that is very similar to how the BEP is funded. I think what was discussed by the commissioner is that the must-haves will all be priced out, and then creating that will be what creates the base amount. And so they'll price out the cost of, let's say we want a counselor for every 200 kids in a school. They'll price that out for every single, student, and, for across the state, and then tell you that the base includes that portion that would, allocate towards that. It wouldn't be restricted to use towards that by any means, but that's how they're thinking about doing the base and then adding the weights on top of it.
But shouldn't it be restricted? I guess my question is, our schools are all asked to accomplish certain strategic plans. And again, if we're moving to a student-based funding formula, then shouldn't that all tie together? So I just want to make sure that if we are focused on students and we're creating this consistent and predictable process, where the base, it's just for, again, the basic funding of without needs, special needs or circumstances, where I guess, again, how do we build? And again, going through this in Florida, because you don't want to set a base and then never fully fund your base. So I guess my hope is that we avoid that as a state and stay away from that. So I get that. I guess I'm still struggling to understand that, and especially in conversations here, that seems to be what I'm hearing here in Knox County, especially from non-educators. When you start talking about everything that's come up, it's hard to convey. So perhaps I'll learn how to do that. So thanks, Katie.
I think there's also been a advocacy for giving schools and districts some flexibility. So the purpose of not making it each one categorical is that if students feel they don't need an expenditure in that area, but more of an expenditure in something else. I think that's at least what I've heard the commissioner. Representative, you had a thought maybe or comment? You're on mute, sorry.
Forgive me. Thank you. Thank you, Dan. And Chris, thank you very much. You hit several nails on the head right there. And that has been one of the conundrums that we have in Tennessee, is that the push is always to have local discretion, local control. And I understand that. And that makes perfect sense, because you want the decisions for our children to be made at the lowest organic level, closest to them, their families, the school boards there. But there are certain subjects that are certain aspects of a funding formula that Tennessee may need to create, and heaven forbid mandates. We don't like the word mandate in the state of Tennessee, but there may be some areas where a new way of funding education says, all right, you must do this in order to provide the best opportunity for student success. So I think that's a way that we need to think outside the box, and that's refreshing to hear from you, Chris. So thank you.
Dan,
Yeah.
I have a question. The state funds what, about 47% of education, the local 45, or it's fluid, but is there any consideration of allocating certain types of funding locally, for example, infrastructure, and other academic and healthcare related funding for the state? In other words, would the state take a piece of what was needed and allocate facilities and buildings and that sort of thing? So could there be a segmented approach in that regard? Katie, I see you shaking your head no, but my question is.
No, I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, so define what the state is going to fund, define what should be local funding, and that would clarify some things. You mentioned internet connectivity, making that available through the educational system is almost an impossibility, but we face those issues too in Southeast Tennessee. And so I'm not sure that that's something that could be solved with BEP funding, but, you know, there are issues that relate to the education of our students and that relate directly to the monies the state is putting in that has to be addressed locally. And so potentially, I'm just suggesting that maybe that approach might be helpful. If the state is going to mandate something, they should fund it. I think that's a bottom line. And of course, having input, for example, healthcare professionals, some of you mentioned that, healthcare professionals, you know, one healthcare professional for thousands of students is totally impractical. It's worthless to fund at that level. It's a waste of money to fund at that level. If you want it to be effective, then fund it at one healthcare professional per 500 students or per 450 students, but don't mandate it and make it a waste of money. You know, I think that that kind of input is critical as the state goes forward. And I just want to make those comments so that they're part of this discussion in terms of what's absolutely necessary. Thanks, Dan, for allowing me to come in and at the end here and mention something like that.
Thanks for sharing that. And I think as we get closer to making recommendations, I think virtually every head went up and down with your comment about fully funding mandated items. So again, those are some things we want to keep track of when we get a little later on in the process. I'm wondering, shall we take a couple more minutes and think about other things that we left off our list, just so we have as robust a list first cut before we end the meeting?
Dan, could Ginger or whoever is keeping the list, could you read it? Because again, I apologize for missing part of it, but it would be helpful to hear it if we could take a minute and do that.
Sure. Ginger, can you do that? I bet you can.
I absolutely can. And I just took them as we went through the list. So you're going to hear some things repeated, which I actually think is really helpful because that shows we already have some consensus across the group on a few of those items. I also wanted to share that you all have brought up several good topics around like the mandated pieces where those might fall within the student based funding. And so those pieces would be things that we would put within that base formula if it's something that is required, such as those are things that we would look at putting in that base if we're moving forward with that student based funding formula. So a lot of great conversation. I also want to commend you all on your list. I know everybody looked a little nervous when Dan said, I'm going to ask each of you to share, but y'all did a great job. So thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go from the top. So we have safe structures and spaces, qualified instructors, and equal access for all students, quality teachers, and pay that supports retention of those teachers, school counselors, mental health counselors, nurses, coaches, and through the coaching lens, we're thinking both instructional and or behavioral coaching, allocations that are consistent and predictable and sustainable, funding that meets the needs of students that are really focused on individual students, intervention specialists speaking specifically to RTI, qualified teachers, safe buildings, and specifically here we're looking at more investments in the actual buildings, buildings and grounds types things, technology, health professionals, both nurses and mental health counselors, and ideally that would be one in each school building, instructional coaches, support staff, that includes custodial and maintenance, assistant principals, department chairs in the high school should be something we're considering when we think about additional funds, nurses, assistant principals at every school, an increase in EL teachers, college counselor, mental health counselor, social workers in every school, so just social workers, internet access, specific supports for students with disabilities, 11 or 12-month contract for college advisors or counselors, literacy and numeracy materials, professional learning, and early post-secondary opportunities such as advanced placement, certifications, dual enrollment, dual credit, etc. If I missed anyone's, please call me out and I'll add it to the list.
One more that I just thought of, Ginger, and also great job on that. That's not easy to capture all of that. So is an increase in paraprofessionals for special education students. I think that para role is really a massive resource for our special ed population that we don't have enough of. So I don't know if that's the must have or nice to have, but just going ahead and capturing that.
Other suggestions to that list, or something that you held back on because you didn't think it was a must-have?
The only other thing that I put it in my should have list, but in retrospect, maybe I should have added it to must have, just because some of the feedback that I've had locally has talked a lot about this, is pre-K as a must have. I don't know if that's appropriate to add to that list or not, but.
Well, let's put it on the list and we'll figure that out later on.
I have a question. Sorry, I'm going to keep throwing curveballs. Is there any desire or thought of, again, I know this goes down to a mandate, but say 90% of the base has to go to addressing individual student experience. So that way you can address transparency, but also make sure that those dollars are going straight to the student. So I guess, Dan, could this group recommend that 90% of the base has to go directly to that student experience? And then I know that opens up the can of worms of measuring and accountability, but I know that would be important for several constituents.
So it's my understanding we could make that recommendation. Ginger, would you agree with that as part of what our recommendations can be?
Yes, I think we can include that as a recommendation. I added it on the list here. And I think that goes back to a question we had from the last call. And so once I get some responses on that, I'll add this one in with that just to make sure we're on the right track. But it doesn't do any harm for us to include it on this list. So consider it added.
Thanks. Other things to add to our list?
Hey, Lisa, can I ask you to clarify your the chat you have about the college counselors? I want to make sure that I'm capturing that in the right way.
Yes, Katie actually answered it correctly. I just obviously didn't type it correctly. So she had put on her must-have. I wrote down college counselors, but I was making sure that when she was saying college counselors, she was actually talking about not just those 4-year universities or the 2-year universities. And she did clarify that. So does that make sense?
Absolutely. And so I guess my question for the group would be, we have college counselor or something pretty similar, college advisor, what have you listed throughout here. Would you all prefer that phrasing actually just be something like post-secondary success counselor? Or feel free to suggest some other, so I'm capturing all of the post-secondary opportunities.
Yeah, and I think that like when I'm talking about counselors, I'm not talking about those post-secondary. So that's the reason I was trying to just qualify what she was speaking about versus what I'm speaking about. So.
Ginger, Diane, one thing that's not on the list is, at least I didn't hear it, school security. I think that is foundational to operation today, and maybe from a standpoint of both personnel and facility. Facilities need modification to be secure. Most of our facilities were not built that way. So I think that's a must-have. Whether that's funded at the state level or the local level, that remains to be seen, but I think that's a must-have.
Okay, I think as we're running a little bit long, though we got some clarification from the commissioner. We're supposed to keep our meetings within a certain time frame, but we can go a little long. So what I would appreciate, just if everybody would keep 90 minutes, we won't probably go 90 minutes each time, but would like to be able to go over. I suspect this is going to get more challenging rather than less challenging as we try and sort these out and add things. So let's say we're going to meet 90. We will publicly, I guess we can't say anything other than that since this is being recorded, but let's try and hold that time. Ginger, shall we go to the last slide?
So our last slide here is just sharing like our next meeting opportunity, which you should already have on your calendar. Linked in there will be the link to the Google Drive. I will get your agenda for the next one loaded in there soon. And as soon as I have other materials, PowerPoint, other things, I'll load that in there as well. Kind of as homework between this session and the next one is to really think about things that you brought up today, things you heard other people bring up today, and take those out to stakeholders, whether it's individuals, small groups, whatever you might have access to, and really get their response to, what else needs to be added here? What sounds like it's on the right track for just including in the formula, and then in what way? Is it a must-have? Is it a nice-to-have? So I think that's kind of your homework assignment between now and then, as well as, looking through any resources or reaching out to each other and having some additional conversation as you continue to form your ideas around the funding.
I'm wondering, does the group want to have an expert from the state at the state list for our next meeting, or do you want to further refine this list and have someone come in and answer some of the more technical questions at our meeting in January? Is there a will of the group?
I think January, Dan, would give us a little more time to talk, get to know each other, sort some of this out, but I'm open to the will of the group, of course.
I agree with January, but I would really like the documents sent to me pretty early so we can do some reviewing. So we actually know which questions we should be asking. So, and with that, I am so sorry. I have to jump off as well. I'll make sure I have the full 90 minutes next time on my agenda.
Terrific. Thank you. Representative, did you have a thought? So you came off mute on when to have the expert?
I like the conversations we're having now. I'm fearful that if we involve, and I'm going to use little air quotes, expert, they might hinder our creative thought that we're having. So I'm encouraging this conversation that we're having right now, and I appreciate the opportunity to think a little bit outside of the box and not be pigeonholed into, well, you have to do this, this, and this, and I'm enjoying this. If at some point in time, later on in January that we might need that, but I'm enjoying the creative conversations we're having.
So I think, unless I hear otherwise, it seems like we have a little bit of consensus around not the December meeting, a January meeting. We'll ask, but we want to get us on the list just because it's a short list and there are 18 subcommittees. So, okay, terrific. I think we've been given a homework assignment, right? Best you can do. I think the other homework assignment is to have a wonderful Thanksgiving, and I hope everybody can eat well and enjoy family and some time to reflect on all of our blessings. And I just thank everybody for being here and staying late, and shout out to everybody, and especially Ginger for working the slide deck. All right. Okay, everybody. Thanks very much. Stay well.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
I'll see you.